Hi, I'm Allison. I'm an educator here at ANGELIC Organics Learning Center, and I'm also a vegetable farmer in Rockford, Illinois. So as a food educator and a vegetable farmer and somebody who eats, I'm really interested in talking to people about how they can incorporate more local food into their diets, and particularly how we in our northern cold climate can be incorporating more local produce during the winter. So today we're going to do that by practicing making quick pickled onions. Quick pickled onions are great for adding to salads. You can use them as a topping on soups or even pizza. And of course you can use them as condiments or even eat them on their own as a snack. Onions are a storage crop, which just means that they can store for a long time after they've been harvested, but not all onions store equally well. So some, especially red onion varieties, like these ones that I have with me here today, will sprout in the early winter. So one thing that we can do when our onions start to sprout is that we can pickle them so that we can store them for even longer. But even if your onions that you're using aren't sprouted, you might still want to pickle them. And the reason why is because some onions have sulfuric compounds in them. The sulfur compounds combine with the tears in our eyes to make us cry when we cut onions, but they are also what give onions their really pungent flavor, which maybe you like, or maybe you're not such a big fan. So by pickling them and introducing an acid ingredient like vinegar, we can really mellow out those sulfur compound flavors and make eating onions a more enjoyable experience. Today we're quick pickling, which means that you shouldn't water bath can or pressure can this recipe. Instead, what you'll do is you'll store your pickles in the fridge. But quick pickling is great because it's a super easy process. There are just 5 steps. The first one is to prepare your produce. The second one is to prepare your add-ins. We'll talk about what those are in a second. The third step is to prepare your brine. The fourth step is to put everything in a jar or other glass container with a lid. And the fifth step is to let your quick pickles hang out in the fridge for at least a couple hours before you eat them. And that's all there is to it. We're going to use really simple ingredients and simple equipment for this project today. So first we'll need our produce. We are using red onions today. You can use whatever onions you have, but red onions make particularly beautiful pickles. We'll also need our add-in ingredients. When I say add-ins, I mean things like herbs and spices, not the main ingredient in your pickles, but things that will enhance the flavor if you choose to use them. You can use whatever sounds good to you. Today what we're using are these crushed red pepper flakes because we like a little spice around here. Ground cinnamon, a cinnamon stick would work well too. We're using this warming spice because we know that we're going to use these pickles in a holiday salad later, so that warm cinnamon flavor will be welcome. We're using ground black pepper. Whole peppercorns work great also. And I think that ground black pepper or peppercorns work well in just about all pickles. So if you're kind of at a loss for what to use, black pepper can be a good place to start. That's our add-ins. Next we need our ingredients for our brine. Our brine is going to start with a vinegar. Our options for what to use today are a white wine vinegar, and a rice vinegar. So the reason why I'm giving these as your options today are because if we used something like an apple cider vinegar, which would taste fantastic, that brown color would make our brine brownish and maybe a little cloudy, which would make our beautiful red onions not look so beautiful in the jar. If you have apple cider vinegar and you love it, then use that. We're using one of these 2 clear vinegars instead of white distilled vinegar because white distilled vinegar just has kind of a harsher flavor, whereas either of these 2 options will have a more mellow, slightly sweet flavor, which is nice in a pickle. Right? The next ingredient for our brine is pickling salt. The measurements that we're giving you in this recipe are for pickling salt, which is milled extra fine. It's got really fine crystals. If what you've got on hand is table salt, that's fine, you can use that, but the crystals are bigger, which means that you're going to need to use more salt. We'll also use some sugar today. The sugar is optional, but even if you don't want a sweet pickle, using just a little bit of sugar in your recipe can help balance the flavors and bring everything together. It just makes everything taste a little bit nicer without making it taste sweet. But if you do want a sweeter pickle, you can definitely use a little bit more sugar and get that sweet flavor. And then finally, we'll need hot water. I like to make my hot water in a hot water kettle. The reason why we need it to be hot is to help the salt and sugar dissolve in the brine. So you could also just make your brine in a pan on your stove top if you don't have a hot water kettle. Equipment-wise, we've got our handy cutting board, a knife, measuring spoons. We're making our brine in a mason jar. We're going to add all of our ingredients and shake it up. But like I said, you could also make your brine in a pan on the stove top. We need a jar with a lid or another glass container with a lid to actually put our pickles in. And optionally, you can use a weight like one of these glass pickle pebbles to hold your produce down below the brine. Pickle pebbles or other weights are used usually in fermentation recipes. I also sometimes like to use them in quick pickling. You wouldn't use something like this if you were making a water bath canned pickle or a pressure canned pickle. It's completely optional. You can also DIY a pickle weight by putting some brine in a Ziploc bag and using that to submerge your pickles, or you can just skip it altogether. I'll show you how it works when we get to that part of the process. All right, so back to our process. The first step is to prepare our produce. You can chop up your onions however you want. You might think about the size and shape of the container that you're putting them in, how you'll be using them once they're ready, and what might look nice. So some options would be to kind of cut them in little wedges. You could chop them up. You could chop them up even finer than that. Today we're going to make ours into rings because I think that it'll look particularly nice in our jars. If you had small cocktail onions, you could even just kind of put them in whole. Something to keep in mind is that the larger the pieces that you use, the longer that it will take for the brine to soak all the way into your onions. And of course, if you're doing something like slicing, it might be a little bit challenging once you get to the center part. You could also do a mix. I'm not here to stop you. So we'll just keep going. I'm using about a pound of onions here. That will probably actually be too much for our jar. If you have too much onion for the size container that you have, you can do multiple containers if you want to. The second step of our process is to prepare our add-ins. Sometimes preparing add-ins might look like chopping an herb or something like that, but in our case, we're just using spices, so all we have to do is measure them. For this particular recipe, we're going to go with about half a teaspoon of chili flakes, about a quarter teaspoon of ground cinnamon, and about a quarter teaspoon of black pepper. You could also use more or less of these spices if you wanted to, and of course, like we mentioned earlier, you can add in other things if you prefer other flavors. So that's all there is to preparing our add-ins today, and we'll move right on into the brine. So we're going to mix our brine in a mason jar. This is going to make a pretty big batch of brine for the amount of produce that we have, but that's okay. You can store leftover brine that you have in your fridge and it will be good there basically, and you can use it for your next batch of quick pickles. I like mixing in a mason jar because it's got the measurements on the side of it, but you could also mix in a measuring cup or something like that. We're going to start by doing 2 cups of our hot water. And we're going to measure in our salt and our sugar before we add our vinegar. So we're going to use 2 teaspoons of pickling salt in our brine. 1, 2. Like I said earlier, if you're using table salt, you might need to use quite a bit more, maybe as much as 2 tablespoons if the granules or crystals are really large. For the sugar, we don't really want these pickles to be sweet exactly. We just want to kind of round out the flavor a little bit, so we're going to use 1 teaspoon of sugar. If you did want your pickles to be a little sweet, you might use as much as like a tablespoon or so. It's really up to you how sweet you want them to be, right? Okay, so we've got our sugar and our salt and our hot water. We're gonna put the lid on and make sure it's on tight, and then we're just gonna, I didn't make sure my lid was on tight. That's my mistake. And then we're just gonna shake our brine around. And we'll check to see that there's no crystals on the bottom. That's why we use the hot water, to make it really easy for the salt and the sugar to dissolve. We're good to go. There's nothing hanging out on the bottom of the jar. So we'll take off the lid and add in our vinegar. We're using the white wine vinegar, and we're gonna use 2 cups of it. This one has a little pour regulator on it, so we'll just pop that off and fill up to the 4-cup mark, which is right here. So this ratio works regardless of which kind of vinegar you're working with. You'll want to go with 2 cups of water to 2 cups of vinegar and 2 teaspoons of pickling salt. So that's our brine ready to go. Our 4th step is to assemble everything in our jar with a lid. So I like to start by putting the spices in at the bottom of the jar. You could also just measure your spices and other add-ins directly into the jar instead of putting them in a bowl. That would probably work better in most cases. So spices and other add-ins in the bottom of the jar. Next, we're going to put our produce pieces in the jar. Depending on how you chop them up, you can just kind of pour them in. Since we specifically cut these to look nice, I'm kind of trying to layer them in neatly. All right. So we want to fill up the jar as completely as we can, up to kind of where the rings for screwing on the cap start. And the reason why we would want to fill up the jar as completely as possible is because it keeps things from floating up to the surface as much, so it helps to pack things in a little bit. But we also don't want to fill it up clear to the very rim of the jar, or whatever container that we're using, because then it would be hard for the brine to cover what's up there at the top. So I'm just going to put a couple more pieces in. Try to push them down a little bit. All right, and now we'll be ready to pour our brine over. We can kind of shake it or tap it to help the brine percolate down to the bottom. There we go. All right. Now, at this point, if you're choosing to use a pickle pebble or some other weight, you would fit that into the surface of your jar and watch as your brine overflows a little bit if you overfilled like I did. But you can see how it lets the brine rise up to the top of the jar while holding the produce down below, and that means that all of our produce is going to be submerged in the brine, which is good for getting the flavors in to the pickle, as well as keeping the pickle from being exposed to the air, which will cause it to go bad faster. So using the weight is an option to help with the lifespan of your pickle in the fridge. Now all that we have to do is screw on our lid. And at this point, we are ready to move on to our fifth step, which is to put it in the refrigerator and let it hang out there for a couple hours before we use it. Oops. That just gives everything time to mix together, let the flavors meld, and let the brine kind of soak into the onion a little bit. So a couple hours or overnight, and then after that you can let it store in the fridge for at least a couple weeks. In my personal experience, you might be able to get even as much as several months of storage time out of your refrigerator quick pickles. With quick pickles, we can trust our senses to let us know when something is off, let us know that we shouldn't eat it. So you'll want to use your eyes to observe whether there might be any mold growing on the surface of the pickle. You can use your nose to kind of see if there are any off smells. And as long as you don't see or smell anything wrong, you're good to go to keep eating them, even if it's been more than a couple weeks. All right. Quick pickling is a super easy and versatile process once you get used to it. So today we use this process to quick pickle onions, but you can use it for all sorts of produce that might be coming out of your garden or that you're getting at the farmer's market or in a CSA. Once you've got your quick pickled onions, you can use them for all sorts of things. They make a great topping for salads, soups, pizza, tacos. You can also use them as a condiment, like on a sandwich. Or you could even maybe snack on them like you might with a cucumber dill pickle. So regardless of what you decide to do with your pickles, I hope that you enjoy them, and I hope that you stay tuned to the videos that we're making to see what we do with ours. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.